Salt Lake City. We got some new music for Talk with Ted. That kind of caught me off guard. That's funky.
Yeah, that is.
Kristen slipped that in on us.
Yeah. I think she wants us to dance.
Welcome. My name's Ted McBride. It's Talk with Ted. It's Tuesday afternoon, October 22nd, 2019. About 4:07 in the afternoon, and fall is in the air. We had a pretty drastic drop of temperature here in Salt Lake City this past week. Some snow on the even down in the valley here, definitely some snow up in the mountains. They had the plowing equipment out, taking care of the roads, and so you can feel sort of a winter setting in. I love this time of year. I like to wear layers of clothing, so I like to bundle up. And they're outside here blowing the leaves. Hopefully they're not making too much noise on us. It's going to be a great show. I've got a great guest lined up for today. Harriet, hopefully I pronounce her name correctly, Hageman, who is an attorney in Washington, D.C. She's originally from and resides in Cheyenne, Wyoming, but she is now with an outfit called the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which is a nonprofit law firm in Washington, D.C. That was established by a legal scholar, a very prominent legal scholar by the name of Philip Hamburger, and he is a professor at Columbia University and has published widely on the issue of the administrative state. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, the administrative state. Last week, I had on a couple of great guests, and I was rushed at the beginning of the show, and I think that was because we were trying to fit in two wonderful guests, and the first was Manny Ahonmi of Samaritan's Feet, a nonprofit in Charlotte, North Carolina, that is focused on providing shoes for people throughout the world. And he was a great inspirational guest. We spoke about his story, a little bit of hoops, Utah Jazz, and then I had the great privilege to host Jeff Birmingham. And Jeff is a Utah County businessman who's making a run for Utah governor. And he trusted me enough to come onto the show for an hour or so, and it was great to get to know him. And he wants to get involved in government to try to, he has said openly, to try to sort of lessen its influence. You know, he's not a proponent of big government. And we spoke about regulatory issues on the local level, regulating small businesses such as hair salons, et cetera. And sometimes the over-licensing of things can be an impediment for people trying to move up through our systems. And so I thought that Jeff Birmingham was very sensitive to those issues. I was impressed with him about that. And now this week we're going to talk about that kind of same issue, but on a broader level, on a national level, about regulation and the administrative state, kind of macro with our guest this week, who we've got listening in, but on hold right now. President Trump was in the news recently. A couple of weeks ago, he issued a couple of executive orders that dramatically influence the authority of the, what I'll call the regulatory state. And there are currently about 220,000 people employed by the United States government in the regulation industry. And a large portion of those people, those civil servants, I guess you'd say, are specialized in medicine, chemistry, science, pollution, safety, and in large part, the administrative state, it's sort of like the government that the government set up. We have our elected representatives, and then you've got these administrative bodies that are established and operated under the purview of the executive branch. They can be staffed by the existing president, and they are in the nature of, enforcement. We've got our three branches of government, the legislative that makes the law, the judiciary that interprets, and the executive that enforces. And the inherent problem with the regulation business is that some of those functions, or all of those functions, are sort of consolidated in these agencies. And some people question the constitutionality of those agencies to begin with, but they really arose out of sort of a necessity. If you can think back, there's been administrative law that's been in existence for hundreds of years, but for our purposes of our discussion, we'll talk about it in terms of American history, and where it first really became prevalent or prominent was in the 1880s with the railroad industry. And there was the agricultural workers actually were implicated in bad conditions, et cetera, but there was moving agriculture along the railroads, and the federal government used that crossing of state lines as sort of the justification to come in and then impose safety regulations, et cetera. At the turn of the century, 1906 or so, was when I think the USDA was set up. And that was at the time, it reminds me of the book Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. And that is a book about the meatpacking industry in Chicago and the horrific and unsanitary conditions. And it was that book and things like that that sort of led to a need for that regulation. And so out of that, came the USDA and the FDA to identify, what are hazards in our modern society and what our government should do to sort of protect us from those hazards. So that grew largely after World War II, or the New Deal in the 30s. Continued after World War II. The Environmental Protection Agency was actually established by Richard Nixon. And he had come up with the idea. There's an executive order to establish it as a formal agency on July 9th, 1970. And then it wasn't but 5 months later, on December 2nd, 1970, that he issued an order that did establish the Environmental Protection Agency. I believe that was then ratified by committee in both the House and Senate. But that's the short story of the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And the EPA has had issues over the years. Folks in Colorado recall just a few years ago with the when they accidentally spilled all of that the mine tailings into the river there. But the EPA has had a number of issues. If you go to Wikipedia and read about the EPA, it's interesting. It even talks about their sort of the political nature of it. And I think this is one of the inherent problems with administrative law, is that it still doesn't escape politics.
Right.
You can't take the politics out of politics. And so now you've got right on the Wikipedia page about the EPA, it's got a notation, scientific integrity official barred from congressional hearing. On July 17, 2019, the top scientific integrity official from the EPA, Francesca Griffo, was not permitted to testify by the EPA in front of a House committee hearing. The EPA offered to send a different representative in place of Griffo and accused the committee of, quote, dictating to the agency who they believe was qualified to speak, end quote. Here's the catch. The hearing was to discuss the importance of allowing federal scientists and other employees to speak freely when and to whom they want to without their research, without having to worry about any political consequences. And so that was the nature of the hearing, the openness, and the EPA apparently interfered with that and sent someone else to speak and to deliver that message. And so I think that there is well-deserved skepticism among people that have been or that have challenged the authority of federal agencies. And, we need regulators. We need protection. We need laws, but there's also opportunity here in this area of law to have tremendous disregard for people's constitutional rights. And let me kind of explain that. Because these agencies deal with these complicated questions, it's sort of a Congress sort of will defer to them. The law is actually designed to defer to them. So these administrative agencies are allowed to make rules, interpret those rules, and then enforce those rules. And they often involve property rights, telling people what they can or cannot do on their property or expenses associated with certain industries. But because they have all three of those functions where they make the law, interpret the law, and enforce the law, they don't have the protections that we have at the federal level with our Constitution to keep those things separate. And there are lawyers on the front line representing people that feel that abuse or potential for abuse on the front line. And one of the things that Harriet is going to help us understand is this rulemaking process. So you've got federal statutes, then below that you've got the Code of Federal Regulations. And below that is where it gets vague, and we're going to talk about President Trump's executive orders and what effect they have on the regulation. Because what I find interesting is that what President Trump did was basically limit the authority of the federal government. And if you go on the mainstream media, there's a lot of news about his signing executive orders, but it doesn't get into great substance about what they say. And so Harriet's going to help us with that. But I think that he did that with the stroke of a pen a couple of weeks ago and did limit the authority, the regulators' authority to sort of interpret themselves without more congressional oversight and approval in the form of formally adopted regulations. And I think that it's important that we keep our legislators honest by keeping our regulatory system honest. So Harriet's got a case in Wyoming where she represents a couple of ranchers who are part of a larger group, but she is engaged in a battle right now with the USDA on regulations that deal with identifying livestock for purposes of tracing disease in the event that that becomes necessary, but basically to identify livestock. And this is not something new. It's something that's been going on for a long time, and livestock are identified with branding and tattoos and tags and have paperwork to back them up, certifications for their, just turn that down for 1 second, immune systems, et cetera. And there have been some major changes, not by adoption of new regulations, but there was a regulation established in 2013 that now some current regulators are trying to interpret in a way that Harriet says is just completely defies the entire purpose and intent of the 2013 regulation. But when we come back, we're going to be talking about monitoring cattle on Wyoming ranches and whether that needs to be done with an electronic ear tag or whether that can be done old school and the legislative basis behind it. So I'll be right back.
What are you doing up here on the roof?
I want to tell the world I just met the woman of my dreams. Well, what about you?
I want to tell the world that Liberty Mutual saved me $782.
Liberty did what?
They saved me $782.
Oh, you go first then. $782 really puts finding love into perspective.
Visit us online to get a quote, and you could save $782. Liberty Mutual Insurance. Based on a recent countrywide new customer survey, coverage is underwritten by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company, Equal Housing Insurer.
Howdy, folks. It's me, Colonel Sanders. My KFC $20 fill-up includes a whole bucket of delicious Kentucky Fried Chicken, 2 sides of mashed potatoes and gravy, coleslaw, and 4 flaky biscuits for just $20. It'll feed 4 people. And it comes with a free bucket. And every time you use that bucket, you'll be reminded of how delicious that meal was. Now that's value. KFC, it's finger-licking good. At participating KFCs for a limited time. Prices may vary. Tax extra. Extra charge for breast piece and side item substitution may apply. Offer includes 8-piece chicken, 3 large sides, 4 biscuits.
Attention all authors. Page Publishing is looking for authors. Have you written a book and want to get it published? Page Publishing will get your book into bookstores and for sale online at Amazon, Apple iTunes, and other outlets. They handle all aspects of the publishing process for you. Printing, cover art, publicity, copyright, and editing. Call 800-501-3689 now for your free author submission kit. That's 800-501-3689 for your free author submission kit. Again, 800-501-3689.
As a small business owner, you make every dollar count. So what could you do with $10? Go to Vistaprint.com today and you'll get 500 high-quality custom business cards for only $9.99. That's less than 2 cents per card. And at Vistaprint, your satisfaction is absolutely guaranteed. So it's never been easier to turn 500 strangers into connections. Just visit Vistaprint.com and use promo code 2000 at checkout. That's Vistaprint.com, promo code 2000.
As a small business owner, you're juggling it all, including customers' calls from your personal phone. But with Grasshopper, you get a business phone number and a business phone system from our mobile app, so you can work smarter, not harder. Grasshopper forwards calls, texts, even transcribes voicemails. Everything you need to simplify your business and stay responsive. With Grasshopper, there's no long-term contracts, and customer support is 24/7. Whether you're starting or growing your business, Grasshopper is the answer. Now get $20 off your first month when you visit grasshopper.com/radio.
Welcome back. Salt Lake City Talk with Ted number 47. And I've entitled this one, Harriet Hageman, a civil rights lawyer. Harriet, are you with us?
I am with you.
How are you?
I'm wonderful, Ted. How are you today?
I'm doing well. It's nice to chat with you again. We caught up last week. I was delighted that you were available to join me, and still am.
Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Are you in Washington, D.C.?
I'm actually in Wyoming.
Oh, you're back home, huh?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And you are with the New Civil Liberties Alliance, and they were kind enough to reach out to me and my former colleague, Mark Shurtleff, who I used to do a radio show with. Shout out to Mark. But we had someone, we discussed the issue of the bump stocks with guns previously. We're not going to do that with you, but we're going to talk cattle today, right?
Yes, we are.
Amazing stuff. And I got a little bit crunched in my opening there. I wanted to share one or two more things in kind of setting this up. Because one of the points I was trying to make, Harriet, is that you can't take the politics out of politics. And in this administrative world that we live in, this regulatory world, I just see a real dangerous political fight.
I think that is a very good way of putting it. And I think that it's very dangerous, especially when you consider the fact that the United States is a republic. We're not a democracy. We are a representative form of government, and we have 3 different branches of government. We have the legislative, we have the executive, and obviously we have the judicial. And what has happened over the last 70 years, and I would say has been on steroids for the last 20 years, is it an effort in many ways to conflate the responsibilities for the 3 branches into one branch, and even worse than that, into the agencies within that one branch. The USDA, EPA, Department of Labor, we can go through a variety of them, Department of Education, all of the different alphabet soups, as we refer to them as, and what's been created is that we've now empowered agencies to make laws, and this is what my organization, my law firm, the NCLA, was created to combat, and I'm very proud that I have had the opportunity to go to work for NCLA to try to address these issues and push back where appropriate.
Yeah, and you've got an interesting website that addresses a bunch of different case studies, and people can go there and look. But you're really kind of taking on the government in all respects at this regulatory level, right?
And that's just it. It's on the regulatory level. This firm was created by a gentleman by the name of Professor Philip Hamburger, and it is designed, the very purpose of our law firm is to address this regulatory overreach that has become so pervasive. We're a nonprofit civil rights organization. That's why it's called the New Civil Liberties Alliance, and it is to protect the constitutional freedoms from violations by regulatory agencies. We work both at state as well as the federal level. So we have a variety of cases that are going on in states, although I would say that our largest target clearly is the federal government.
It's interesting to me. I discuss on the program here civil rights, racism, mental health, of a whole variety of things, some political philosophy, Bob Rule, questioning, reasons against democracy, that sort of thing. But I think that the public at large doesn't really appreciate the important civil liberties at stake in this area of law. And I think that one reason for that is because it's dealing principally with money. A lot of times it's regulation that affects people's bottom line, but it's due process of law, right? You can't be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Well, that's just exactly right, and we do handle quite a few cases that are focused specifically upon due process. We also handle cases that arise out of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, the due process issues.
Again, all in the regulatory context. It all comes
Absolutely.
Up there, doesn't it?
It does, and the reason that this is so significant is because what has happened is that it's a lack, in large part, a lack of accountability, because the folks who are regulating us are not accountable to us. And that's why I keep coming back to the fact that we are a republic and the significance of that. We send our elected representatives to our county commissions, to the city council, to the state legislatures, to Congress, to the President of the United States. But we elect those representatives to represent us and represent our interests. When they start turning over the lawmaking responsibility to agencies and individuals who are not elected by us and are no longer accountable to us, then you start seeing things that are just flat wrong, and especially under our form of government. So one of the problems that I see is not just the fact that you've got regulatory agencies that are regulating when they shouldn't be regulating, but you also have legislators and congressional representatives that have now found a way to basically abdicate their responsibility of governing. So when you say you can't take the politics out of politics, I agree with you. But what has happened is, especially at the federal level, which is where I see it has become so insidious, is that our federal representatives, our senators and House representatives in the House, are no longer governing at all.
They don't have to make those hard decisions.
They don't have to make the hard decisions, and because of that, they don't have to be accountable for the hard decisions. I cannot tell you the number of times I've sat in a room with elected representatives who pound the table and rend their clothing and yell at the top of their lungs about these nameless, faceless bureaucrats, these unaccountable bureaucrats, these unaccountable agency folks, these unaccountable government employees who are making law, whether yelling about the EPA or USDA or Department of Education, whatever it may be, yet the person who is making those accusations and pounding the table have the ability to fix it, but they don't. And that is one of the things that I think has become so dangerous about this, is we're really letting our representatives off the hook. They no longer have to negotiate. They no longer have to work across the aisle. They no longer have to work with each other to try to actually solve problems, because basically they've turned over that responsibility to these agencies.
Yeah, and then we're governed by that group, right? That group of engineers and scientists and the folks that think they know what's best for us, but then it's not through our processes.
Well, that's exactly right. And the other side of it is, you mentioned it just a moment ago, is that the cost associated with it. I think a lot of people think, well, it doesn't necessarily affect me, but it affects every aspect of our lives. The cost of the regulatory regime in this country every single year right now is at $2.1 trillion. So the regulations that are imposed, whether it is by the Department of Labor, USDA, EPA, Department of Education, again, I keep coming back to some of these same Department of Transportation, all of those, there is a cost associated with those regulations. And the cost associated with the federal regulations, I will state it again, is a hidden tax of $2.1 trillion a year. So our constructing highways is more expensive. Building furniture is more expensive. Building homes is more expensive. All of us pay for it, but it's a hidden tax. The receipts, the federal government has receipts income tax of about $4 trillion a year. So literally, we have a hidden tax of another 50% that is imposed by these regulations against the citizens of the United States every single year, and most people don't even recognize that it exists.
Incredible. Then you're into the nuance that when we come back from the next break, we got a few more minutes before we go to the commercial, but when we come back, I'm going to have you explain your case in Wyoming a bit. But to set that up, Harriet, would you explain for us the rulemaking process of these agencies, and how do you go about adopting a federal regulation, and then how are interpreting those being abused?
You bet. The modern regulatory regime that we see right now was in large part created by President Roosevelt. The very first Federal Register was published in 1936. Part of the New Deal. And this was his effort to basically amalgamate power within the executive branch, and that's what he attempted to do. So what happened was that's when you started seeing these agencies adopt what they referred to as regulations. But there wasn't any kind of an Administrative Procedure Act that existed at that time. So Congress, recognizing how this could be abused and what was happening and that there was a lack of uniformity in terms of how all these agencies were acting, they created the Administrative Procedure Act in 1946. And that Administrative Procedure Act was designed to give us a uniform mechanism by which these agencies could adopt rules and regulations that would affect interstate commerce, that would affect home building, whatever it may be.
And theoretically incorporate our protected constitutional rights into that system.
Absolutely, that there would be a process. We refer to it often as a notice and comment process. So the mechanism is that the agency announces we're going to adopt a rule. We're going to evaluate whether we should adopt any kind of traceability requirements for moving livestock interstate. That's the case that we are dealing with in Wyoming right now. So in 2011, USDA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking pursuant to the APA that said we are considering whether we should have official identification requirements for certain types of livestock, and bison and sheep and horses and dairy cattle and chickens. And then they go through the process, and people get to comment, and they have meetings, and they come in and they say, you can't do this because of X, Y, and Z, or you should do this because of X, Y, and Z, or you need to be careful of how this works because of X, Y, and Z. There's essentially a public process where anybody who is going to be subject to that regulation has the ability to participate and say, this is why I should be exempted, or this is why this group ought to be included. It can be a wide variety of things. And eventually, after a couple of years of that process, and they usually take a couple of years for a major rulemaking to be implemented, then you're hoping that the agency has sufficient information to make a good decision. So it is very much public process oriented. Then, at the end of that, the agency will issue a document. They will publish a document in the Federal Register with a preamble explaining what they did and why, and laying out the rationale for the regulation. And then they will include the entire text of the regulation so that everybody knows what the agency is
So
doing.
it all sounds good so far?
That's the process that is and should be followed, but it's not the process that always is followed. And that's where we come in. So that is, in a nutshell, it can be a bit more complicated than that, but that is the only mechanism by which an agency actually has the legal authority to adopt a regulation that can be enforced against you and I, the citizens of this great country.
So now in your case, I read your complaint. You filed a lawsuit in the Federal District Court, District of Wyoming. I'm not sure. There's probably only one district in Wyoming. Am I right about that? Or are there two?
You are correct.
Okay, just one.
Just one.
Very least populated state or second least populated state in the country, I think Wyoming is. Least, okay. And you represent a husband and wife as well as a public corporation, an outfit set up by cattle herders from all across the country, and you've now challenged this change to a rule, because there was a rule in 2013 that considered this electronic ear tag for cattle and decided against it, that it was sufficient to have the metal tags that are freely distributed, I think, by the states, but had considered these things. And then there was some sort of fact sheet or memo that came out a few months ago that seemingly purports to change that and require cattle herders to have this electronic ear tag by, I think, January of 2023. And the curious thing about it is that if you don't move your cattle across state lines, you're not affected by it. You don't have to have that electronic tag. But if you move your cattle across state lines, you have to have that electronic tag. And I believe that your client's situation is such that there are no facilities in Wyoming where all of the cattle have to be shipped across state line to be slaughtered, and so you've got an equal protection issue, as well as some question of the legitimacy of this change in 2019. Am I right about that?
Yes, you are correct.
And
all of that is correct.
And before we go into this break, did you know that President Trump would be issuing those executive orders when you filed your lawsuit?
No, I did not.
That was just a sort of a coincidence?
Yes, it was.
And how do those orders affect your lawsuit?
Well, there is potentially a relationship, and I think it's going to take some time for us to unpackage all of this and go through what the interrelationship is between our lawsuit and the executive orders. But I was not aware. I did hear of the potential executive orders shortly before they were issued, but I had no idea at the time that I was drafting this complaint that the president also recognized the problem of what we were dealing with. And the irony is such that I really commend him for recognizing the importance of this, because as we can get into in more detail during your program, these guidance documents are very insidious because they're unconstitutional, and they are a mechanism by which these agencies are circumventing that more complicated, timely, time-consuming process that I just described under the APA. And they're basically saying, well, we're just going to impose a regulation against you. We're just not going to call it that.
Well, get ready to describe it in a little more detail. I hear the commercial coming up, Harriet. So let's put you on hold for a few minutes, and when you come back, we're going to break it down again.
You're listening to KTalk Radio, KBJA 1640 AM, Sandy, Salt Lake City, and all across the Wasatch Front. Bringing you live, local, two-way talk.
It's the little things, like getting flowers for no reason at all. Aw, love you too, boo. Or feeling the love from your favorite store. At Bell's, customers get all sorts of perks, like Style Circle Rewards, which give cardholders double points every day on every purchase. Or Club 40 and Fabulous, where everyone 40 and up gets an extra 20% off on Tuesdays, even on our best spot-on values. Fresh styles, big savings, and fun perks every day. Bell's, little things mean everything. Bell's is part of our Sage family. Offer exclusions apply.
She used to play hide and seek in your backyard. Now, she's getting married in it. So when you see a bare spot, you need something that patches it fast. Pennington One Step Complete has a revolutionary formula that repairs bare spots in only 2 weeks or less. Pennington has been trusted since 1945, and now it works even faster. One Step Complete from Pennington. Honest green. Get your lawn ready for any occasion. Head to your local retailer to pick up One Step Complete.
Posting your job opening to an online job search site is like drinking from a fire hose. You get more resumes than you know what to do with. Robert Half is the better way to hire. Our candidates are interviewed and custom matched to your exact hiring requirements. Quickly, satisfaction guaranteed. So what you need is just what you'll get. Robert Half, the experts in accounting, finance, IT, legal, marketing, and administrative staffing. Learn more at roberthalf.com/radio.
The 4 for $4 from Wendy's has a lot of fans because it's a deal that gives you a sandwich plus 4 nuggets, a small fry, and drink, all for just $4. But now the 4 for $4 has more variety than ever with 8 sandwich choices.
I'm loyal to the double stack.
I'm Junior Bacon Cheeseburger through and through.
I pledge myself to the crispy chicken sandwich.
I'm loyal to my hunger. Whether you're loyal to one sandwich or all 8, the Wendy's 4 for $4 has a sandwich for you. So try them all and pick your favorite. Now that's deliciously different.
At participating Wendy's for a limited time. Offer not valid in Alaska and Hawaii.
Hi, Grandpa. I'm reading a great book about astronaut Abby. Have you read it?
No, the print is just too small.
NLS is a free library service from the Library of Congress for people who have difficulty reading print.
Hi, sweetie. There's no place like space. I listened to your book thanks to NLS.
Call 800-300-6000 today.
If you run a small business, you know there's nothing small about it. Dell's Small Business Technology Advisors are here to help with solutions tailored to your business. Get the latest technology, like Dell laptops with Intel Core processors. Plus, with free shipping and a price match guarantee, you know you're always getting the best deal. Talk to a Dell Small Business Advisor today at 877-BUY-DELL. That's 877-BUY-DELL.
Welcome back, Salt Lake City. Talk with Ted. The new music's kind of throwing me off there. I'm not sure what that was. Harriet, are you still with us?
I am.
Excellent, thank you. How's the weather in Cheyenne?
It's been cool, but I think we're going to warm up this weekend.
Excellent. It's cold here. Snow in the mountains. Do you ever get out to Utah?
I do, every once in a while. I've been out there a couple of times over the last few years. It's a beautiful, beautiful state.
Fast-growing state, too. And, of course, we've got issues that overlap with the politics of Wyoming. You know, there's a lot of rural land and federally controlled land and ranchers and mineral rights and, the whole list of issues here in Utah.
Very similar issues between Wyoming and Utah. There are quite a few states in the western United States that have those types of issues, but I think Utah and Wyoming are very closely aligned on quite a few issues.
And I've got your bio here. I'm going to read at the top of the hour the article that you wrote about these changes that President Trump has done, the transparency and fairness. Bringing guidance out of the darkness. But to set that up, I'm going to read off of the White House website their declaration of what President Trump was doing. Today, President Trump signed 2 executive orders that will improve the transparency and fairness of government agencies and ensure that they are held accountable. The improved agency guidance documents executive order requires agencies to put their guidance documents on easily searchable websites so individuals are able to access them. To ensure Americans have their voices heard, the order will also require government agencies to seek public input on the most important guidance they issue. Americans will be able to ask agencies to withdraw guidance they believe is wrong. Transparency and Fairness Executive Order prohibits agencies from enforcing rules that they have not made publicly known in advance. The order also instructs agencies to offer opinion letters to individuals and businesses who request them so that people who want to comply with the law can learn how. Do you agree with the essence of that, what I just read, that was sort of the purpose and intent of these executive orders?
It appears so. From the executive orders, yes. And I've also looked at some of the information put out by the White House. And again, I have to commend them for actually recognizing the problems with guidance, because I believe it's the first administration that probably realizes and understands the unconstitutional nature of these acts. The fact is that that this guidance is unconstitutional because it divests the legislature of making the decisions, of making the policy, of making the laws. And it also avoids judicial review. One of the problems that you always have with guidance, or that we have as practitioners, is that when an agency issues guidance and we want to challenge it because it is either going to result in a substantial financial burden to our clients, or it's going to be technically infeasible, there might be a variety of reasons, what these agencies will come back with and say, hey, that's not a final rule. That's not subject to judicial review because it's not a final rule. So they adopt these rules through guidance. They adopt these guidance statements, fact sheets, policy statements. They use a variety of names. They're not always called guidance. But guidance is kind of the umbrella word that we use for these agency actions. And basically they say, we're just trying to give the regulated public an idea of how we understand these regulations or these statutes to work. These are not necessarily legally binding, but they are legally binding. Some are.
They're legally threatening, right?
They're legally threatening, and it's also going to depend upon what the guidance is.
KBJA, AM 1640.
Oh, sorry about that little malfunction.
That's okay. There may be a guidance that's pretty innocuous, and it just says, "Look, this is what the 2013 regulation on animal identification said." And it says that if you run livestock and you want to move them across state line, official identification will be brands, tattoos, back tags, group identification numbers, or whatever else the states and tribes want to allow you to use. We are going to make it so that states and tribes are prohibited from mandating RFID, which is the radio frequency identification, but these other types of identification, they're perfectly fine. That's what they did in the 2013
That was 2013.
regulation. That was 2013.
So let me just let me back you up so that people can kind of understand that a little better. So this whole issue of whether the livestock would be tracked with the radio frequency identification, this was at issue in the heart of this debate in 2013, where it was determined that you would not have to have those radio frequency identifiers, correct?
That is correct. What they did with the 2013 regulation, and I have it in front of me right now, it can be found published in the Federal Register at 78 Federal Register 2040, so page 2040, volume 78, 2040 in the Federal Register. And again, this particular rulemaking went through the proper process. They followed the APA. They put it out for notice. They put it out for comment. They received comment. They made changes to the proposed rule.
Were your folks involved in that comment process back then?
Absolutely, they were. And in fact, one of the attachments to our complaint are the comments that were submitted by RCAF. So my clients have been very actively involved in this entire process for the last 10 years, because obviously it's significant to the livestock industry as a whole. So they've been very involved in this entire discussion, and they attended meetings. They, as I said, submitted comments. They participated in conference calls. They looked at what was going on with the USDA.
And again, the backdrop for the regulation here, this is about being able to trace animals in the event of disease. Is that correct?
That's what the stated purpose of it is. But we already have that. We already have the ability to do that. But that's the stated purpose. Is they say, well, we want to be able to identify if there is some kind of a disease outbreak, or there is one cow that may test positive for a particular disease. We want to be able to trace that particular cow back to the owner, back to the location where it was raised quickly. They can do that
electronically, because they do all of that and have been doing that for over 100 years, right?
Right, through brands and that's what the 2013 rule was about. What the USDA did is they identified, or they laid out, about 6 different forms of identification that livestock producers could use in order to be able to move their cattle interstate. And it applied to bison, as I said, and dairy cows and horses. My clients are cattle producers. That's why I focus on the cattle side of it. But the rule laid out, the rules under the mechanisms, the different kind of traceability tools that were available to livestock producers, and they said these are the official identification. Now, that went through a formal rulemaking process, and the final rule is published in the Code of Federal Regulations. You referenced the CFR a few minutes ago.
And your industry raised the cost prohibitiveness of it back then, right?
Well, absolutely. In fact, it was the one of the things that an agency is required to do when it goes through a rulemaking is identify how much it is going to cost, what that particular rulemaking, what kind of costs are going to be imposed against the industry and the public as a whole. And they estimated the cost of that identification rule to be between about $10 million and $35 million. $10 million on the low side, $35 million on the high side to implement it, because most livestock producers already brand or use ear tags or use back tags or use tattoos or a combination of those. So our livestock producers have been identifying their livestock for a variety of reasons for well over 100 years. So what they said is that it would cost as much as $35 million. Now, one person wrote in their comments, and this is included actually in the published preamble to the rule when it was published in the Federal Register, and they said if you require the industry to go to a full RFID, it could be between $1.2 billion and $1.9 billion. And the USDA said, okay, but we're not doing RFID. We're not requiring RFID. So those numbers, we don't know if they're accurate or not, but the fact is that isn't what we're doing. We're not requiring RFID. Well, here we are 6 years later, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, USDA issues a fact sheet, a 2-page fact sheet that says, well, we're going with full RFID. You want to move your livestock interstate, you are required to put an RFID ear tag on every single head of livestock that you move across the state line.
Yeah, and I'm holding it in my hand. I'm going to read a paragraph from it, if that's okay.
You bet.
USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, dated April 2019. And it's called just that, Fact Sheet. Advancing Animal Disease Traceability, a plan to achieve electronic identification in cattle and bison. Animal disease traceability helps animal health officials know where diseased and at-risk animals are, where they've been, and when. This information is essential during a disease outbreak. USDA is currently working to strengthen its traceability system to protect the long-term health, marketability, and economic viability of the U.S. livestock industry. Achieving this goal is only possible through continued federal, state, and industry collaboration. And they go on to say this is an essential move that we now need to tag the cattle with radio frequency identification. So where's the authority, though, from this fact sheet? You know, I understand the regulation that was adopted in 2013, but who is it that can kind of create this and change that regulation?
They can't. That's the point of our lawsuit. They don't have the legal authority to issue a fact sheet that nullifies a properly adopted regulation. That is the crux of our entire case.
But they think they have that authority, right? Do they believe that they're just interpreting the regulation?
It's very difficult for me to speak on behalf of USDA. All I can tell you is that anyone who understands the APA and understands how rulemaking works knows that what they tried to do here is illegal. I have been practicing in this area for going on 20 years. I have never seen a circumstance where an agency was so blatant in using a guidance document. In this case, it's called a fact sheet. As I said, they can be called a variety of things. I have never seen an agency that was as blatant as this agency has been with this particular rulemaking. They have taken a 2-page fact sheet and attempted to amend, nullify, do away with, however you want to describe it, a properly adopted regulation. That violates the APA. That violates the law. And that's why we sued. They don't have the legal authority to do it.
Even if they did have the legal authority, would you still be suing them that it violates the Equal Protection Clause, that your folks are treated differently than someone who doesn't have to move their cattle across state lines?
There are a variety of other issues associated with this fact sheet and what the USDA is attempting to do. For example, again going back to the 2013 rulemaking, they specifically acknowledged that there is a concern about whether this is an unconstitutional taking of property without just compensation. USDA recognizes that imposing an RFID-only mandate is a very extreme measure by this agency. They have repeatedly stated leading up to 2013 and in the last 6 years, that they have to go through a formal rulemaking process in order to impose traceability requirements on livestock producers.
It seemed like they identified a number of compelling public policy reasons back at the 2013 process to not implement it.
Absolutely, they did. And one of them is there were two overriding factors that they repeatedly discussed in the 2013 rulemaking, and that was maximum flexibility as well as being cost-effective. So whatever rule they adopted needed to provide for maximum flexibility, and it needed to be cost-effective, not cost-prohibitive. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that, and it's this.
Harry, I'm going to have you can't hear the music. We're going into the top of the hour commercial.
Okay.
If I could put you on hold, when we come back, we're going to talk more about this, and you can give examples of your challenging government abuses and fighting the administrative state. We'll be right back after the national news with Harriet. I can't pronounce. I got to pronounce it right. Hageman. Thanks, Harriet. We're having trouble with the national news feed, so I'm just going to keep going here. Let's tap Harriet back in. We get interrupted, we can do that. It might just be the local one and the national one. Harriet, you still with us?
I'm still with you.
Well, we're struggling with the technology. It's a weekly event for me. It's a little bit embarrassing, but this is a very grassroots, organic radio show that you agreed to appear on. We're not too fancy, but we're addressing some great stuff with you. I have a feeling we're going to get cut off again here in a minute. But you were just going to give some examples of some abuses, I think, or do you recall what your thoughts were?
Yes. One of the problems is, and one of the things that the USDA actually recognized in the 2013 rulemaking, is that cattle production operations are different in every state in the nation. And oftentimes they're different depending on where you're located in a state. So having a one-size-fits-rule mandate come out of Washington, D.C. isn't going to work everywhere. And that's why flexibility is so incredibly critical. And I'm going to give you an example of this. And I'm just going to read a couple of things to you that I think are very important. So they had their very first traceability meeting in Chevy Chase, Maryland, I believe that it was, right outside of Washington, D.C. And in cattle operation that you would have around Chevy Chase, Maryland, it's going to be very, very, very different than the cattle operations that you have in Wyoming or Utah or Nevada or Montana. And so if you try to adopt a rule that's going to apply in Chevy Chase, Maryland or in Florida, it is going to not work very well in Wyoming. It's one of the biggest criticisms I have about these agencies adopting these one-size-fits-all rules that are supposed to apply to 330 million people throughout the United States. They fail by the very weight of the fact that things are different everywhere we go, whether you're in Cheyenne, Wyoming, or Lincoln, Nebraska, or Des Moines, Iowa. And it's the same with the cattle industry. In the West, we may run one cow on 200 acres. That may be all that that 200 acres can sustain. And what's important for our states in the West is that cattle grazing may not only be the highest and best use for particular lands, it may be the only mechanism by which we can extract any kind of value out of those lands whatsoever. So, for example, we have cattle producers, Tracy and Donna Hunt, and they run cattle in both Wyoming and in South Dakota. That's a little different
than the folks in Chevy Chase, for sure, right?
Absolutely. So they run on what's called a common allotment in South Dakota. It's over 400,000 acres. And there are many, many, many different producers from Wyoming and South Dakota that run on that common allotment. That is going to be very different than when, again, you're in Texas, or you've got a confined animal feeding operation in Kansas City, Missouri. There are so many differences between these areas that the idea of RFID, if you move your livestock by horseback, how do you even get them RFID'd? If you don't run them through a sale barn, if you sell privately, how do you get them RFID'd? I mean, there's all different kinds of things technologically.
So now I've got to stop you there, because you're talking to a New York City suburb boy, not a cowboy. But you say when you're a horseback, what are you talking about there?
Well, for example, I come from a ranch near Fort Laramie, and most of the work that my family members do in terms of moving cattle or working cattle is they're on horseback. And they'll move cattle from pasture to pasture, depending upon the time of year, for example. Or when they go out and we brand and ear tag and all of those things. This isn't in a nice little area where you can have corrals set up and
that's the contrast that you're making. The horseback, these cattle are out in the Wild West.
Absolutely. That's why it's the Wild West.
Even roaming across state lines, right?
Exactly. And when you have these big common allotments, your cattle may very well be intermingled with other people's cattle.
Yeah.
So in South Dakota, if the Hunts are running their livestock on 400,000 acres, there are other cattle producers in there as well. In other words, the idea of RFID doesn't even make sense under those circumstances. Not if the stated purpose of the RFID is what they're attempting to carry out. And so, again, you've got an order, a decision coming out of Washington.
And even that, I think the stated purpose of that radio transmitter is really just to have faster speed of an investigation and the result of an outbreak. But it doesn't really indicate that that can't be accomplished anyway, or that that much difference in that timing would justify this type of regulation.
That is a very important point as well, and that is we already have animal identification and traceability. We have that.
Including for those animals that cross the state line. I read that in your complaint that you've got the state veterinarian from South Dakota understands that that's what's happening, right?
That's exactly right. So the cattle will go back and forth between Wyoming and South Dakota. And sometimes they haul them by truck and sometimes they move them on horseback. So again, it is a feasibility issue, but it's also an issue. I always say that so many of our agencies are always trying to, government in general is trying to fix its last solution. And I always ask a fundamental question of what is it you're trying to fix here? What is it that's broken that you feel warrants as much as $2 billion additional cost on the industry and ultimately the consumer? What is it you're trying to fix? And you hit the nail on the head, which is one of them is speed, but it's beyond that because they have the brands, they have the brand inspection, they have the tattoos, they have the ear tag numbers, they already have that information. What this does is this rule also requires that every single rancher, every single livestock producer register their property with the federal government. And it's the premises identification number. Again, going back to the final rule from 2013, USDA fully recognized that the industry was not on board.
But are the tags currently, are the ear tags currently then state identification?
They can be. They can be. They can have. You can have official ear tags with the USDA shield on them. It depends upon what the state requires. because that was the other aspect of this, and something I agree with from the 2013 regulations,
state to
is
state.
that it's primarily implemented by the states and tribes.
Yeah. But now they want to do a one-size-fits-all and mark all of that property with their electronic identifier.
That's exactly right. And then if what comes along with a PIN, what comes along with a premises identification number. But USDA recognized in 2013 that these landowners were saying absolutely not. There is absolutely no reason for that. They pushed back, and USDA agreed. That's one of the things that they're changing with this new fact sheet. They are now mandating that every livestock producer in the nation identify a premises identification number. And every one of their livestock will then be tied to that specific premises pursuant to that electronic PIN. And livestock producers are saying no. But here's the thing I'll keep coming back to. If USDA really believes that these are things that are necessary, then they need to go through the rulemaking process to do it. They haven't done that, and until they do it, they don't have the legal authority to impose these requirements on our livestock producers. And, Ted, this is why this is so important. This isn't just about livestock producers. They're the victims today. It's any other industry tomorrow. If there are no bookends, if there are no limits on what an agency can do in terms of making laws and imposing obligations upon citizens, in this case, our livestock producers, then it is the trucking company, and it is the tree growers, and it is the car manufacturers. And I know all of your listeners are saying, well, they already do that to everybody. This is getting worse. This is taking it to an entirely new level.
And I think this is where it's most acute, too, because those things that you just spoke of, the truck, the tree, the car, that's fine. But you're talking about the cattle. We're talking about agriculture and our food source.
Yes.
And then dictates an additional costs on people with respect to that food source. I find that particularly troubling, especially when the EPA, is in the news with Monsanto and Roundup, and there are some things being discussed in lawsuits about in investigations that results that should have been disclosed long ago that weren't, and influences within the EPA, and that's kind of what I was talking about in the intro, that nobody's free of the politics and the influence, and if we just defer everything to these agencies that still operate, politically with that consolidated power, it's a really dangerous world.
It's a very dangerous world, and it's absolutely the antithesis to the foundation and framework of our government. And that's what I am always going to come down to. I don't give much truck to people when they say, well, yeah, but it's good for us, or yeah, but it's protecting us, or yeah, but it's doing this, and it's no.
Ronald Reagan used to say, we need so much protection from each other, we could never afford it.
There is a reason why our government was set up the way that it was, and there's a reason why we have individual states. And the fact is that our federal government is a government of limited power. It was designed to be a government of limited power. The authority and most of the power is to reside in the states. And that, because, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, all of our states are very different from each other. Wyoming is not Wisconsin. Florida is not California. Nevada isn't New Hampshire, nor should they be. One of the things that's so exciting and robust and that provide and is the foundation for the successes that we have in this country, our prosperity, is that we do have different cultures. We do have different areas. We do have different terrain and geography and vegetation and livestock production and all of these different things that make us all Americans. We're all from the United States, but we all have our own individual psyches. I'm a Wyomingite through and through. You can probably tell that. I love Wyoming. I love spending time in Washington, D.C. as well, but Wyoming is my home. I am very proud of being a Wyomingite, and you're proud of your heritage, and Utahns are proud of their heritage. And we have these differences, and we have a federal government that is attempting to encroach more and more and more upon what those differences are and make us completely homogenous.
And then we have just black and white politics, too, where, like I was saying, there'll be reported that President Trump, issued executive orders, and immediately people say, oh, well, he's anti-environment and he's taking the funding away from the EPA and he's just doing it to benefit his rich cronies, etc. But the public often doesn't see that sort of abusive side and the many people that suffer from especially those vague or arbitrary regulations.
I'm going to take it even further. The further an agency is removed from the resources that they're attempting to manage, the worse they are at it. I'm going to be very blunt about that. About 45% of Wyoming's surface estate is owned by the federal government, whether it's BLM lands or Forest Service lands, as well as they have quite a substantial interest in our mineral rights in the state of Wyoming as well. And the entire western United States is that way. I think Idaho has the largest percentage of federal lands, and Nevada is about 80% owned by the feds. But the fact is, when they're making resource management decisions in Washington, D.C., they fail at a much higher rate, and as a result, it negatively impacts our environment. Again, the closer you are to the resource you are managing, the better you're going to be at it. So when they created the Clean Water Act, for example, and the EPA in the 1970s, the federal government's jurisdiction is limited to navigable waters of the United States, the big guys, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the North Platte, the big guys. States and local
my little homemade canoe.
Well, and states and local communities are responsible for protecting the smaller streams and water bodies. Why? Because they understand the area. They understand the geography. They understand the geology. They understand the precipitation or lack thereof. They are closer to the resource, and as a result, they are more effective at managing it. And I have seen it almost every day of my legal career.
We manage the water here in Utah, of course, capturing it off the mountains to keep the city alive.
And the people that work in the state of Utah, your state engineer's office, if that's what it's called in Wyoming, your Department of Natural Resources, whatever the name of it is, they're very effective at managing those resources from the standpoint of both water quality and water quantity. That's what they do. They understand it. They live it. They get it. When you look at what has happened, I'll give you another example. In 2001, one of the very last things that Bill Clinton did on his way out of office was signed the roadless rule. And the roadless rule was done by the Forest Service. It denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands. The vast majority of were in the western United States. Again, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico. And what have we seen in the last 19 years? It has been a conflagration almost every single year. That roadless rule has been one of the most environmentally destructive regulations ever passed by a federal agency, and it was done to, quote, protect our national forests. But what have we had since? A huge uptick in catastrophic forest fires because there's no way to manage the resource, and the pine beetle outbreak, both of which they knew were going to happen if, in fact, they adopted the roadless rule. So when people talk about, well, they're doing this and they're going to destroy the environment, or we have to have the EPA adopt all these regulations because we have to protect the environment, what they don't recognize is that a lot of these agencies are not protecting the environment, and the policies and guidelines that are coming out of these agencies are not protecting our resources. They're dooming them. So if people want to have that debate and that discussion, I'm perfectly happy to have it because I lived firsthand with those decisions coming out of D.C., and I've seen the devastation that they have brought. Coming back to this lawsuit, coming back to this issue, if they want to adopt a regulation that is going to impose these kinds of costs on the livestock industry, they need to do it the right way. If they're not going to do it the right way, we're going to sue them. And that's what this lawsuit is about. It comes down to the fact that we really are a government of laws. We really do believe that the Constitution says what it says for a reason. We really do believe in separation of powers. We really do believe that states are where so many of these decisions should be made because they're better at representing their citizens. All of those things. I'm not trying to vilify anyone. I'm simply stating that we are a country of 330 million people. And again, Wyoming is not Wisconsin, and it shouldn't be treated as such.
And we just need to guard against government abuse. You know, it's really the history of government, right? Absolute power absolutely corrupts, and here, to me, it's just kind of shifted. We've kind of delegated that authority to these administrators, sort of like the 200,000 specialists that we must defer to, and because of that, I think we've lost some of that unique local cultural identity. It's troubling.
I agree with you, and I also do think it's important from the standpoint of liberty and freedom, because that was the rallying cry of our forefathers, and it should continue to be our rallying cry today, because it really is the foundation of our prosperity. And the reason that the United States is different from other countries is because of freedom and liberty, as provided for and protected by our Constitution, and we cannot give that up.
Yeah. At the end of this fact sheet, Harriet, it's got the USDA will maintain a list of approved manufacturers. Accredited veterinarians or producers may purchase official approved tags directly from tag manufacturers or retailers. I just find that kind of curious. At the end of it, of course, you've got to buy their merchandise from their approved manufacturers.
Well, and it was manufacturers who were on the advisory committee pushing for RFID.
Oh, you got to be kidding me! Now you sound like a crazy skeptic.
Okay,
it's kind of how the world turns, right? And I think too that with politicians, they're subject to bribes and kickbacks, like in direct contracts and things like that. You even see it in simple things like HOAs, and property managers for HOAs can direct, snow removal contracts to their friends and get kickbacks. And I think that authorizing this administrative state to draft, interpret, and enforce their rules when so many of them are subject to political influence and corruption and stories of people not doing their jobs. I think it's important that we try to rein it back and that we try to have the private sector help solve our problems, not the government.
The private sector tends to solve problems because there has to be accountability, or you don't financially survive. And in fact, one of the claims that we brought in this lawsuit was that USDA violated what we refer to as the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And the Federal Advisory Committee Act is a statute that Congress passed in order to prevent these agencies from listening to only a select few people when they're trying to make these decisions. So if you'll remember when Hillary Clinton was First Lady and she put together that group of people dealing with, at that time, what was going to be Hillary Care, and she was sued because her advisory committee only had representatives that supported what they were trying to do. So she was sued under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. We've brought one of those because when I say that there were manufacturers sitting there at the table, there were. And what happened here was that it was a fairly large group of people that started out with this entire RFID and animal identification issue. And what USDA did is they just continuously removed people from that committee until they were left with the small group of people that all supported RFID. One of the primary gentlemen who was involved with that, one of the primary gentleman involved with the program works for an RFID tag manufacturer.
Harriet, we're into another commercial. If I can have you hang on for a couple minutes. This feed is going through, and then we're going to reintroduce your lawsuit to the people that are just joining us commuting home on Tuesday afternoon. We'll be right back with Talk with Ted.
Screener questions based on your job requirements. Then zero in on qualified candidates using an intuitive online dashboard. Discover why 3 million businesses use Indeed for hiring. Post a job today at Indeed.com/hire. Search for greatness. Search Indeed.
Are we ready to open next month?
I think so.
You think so?
Well, it's complicated. Fire protection, first aid supplies, uniforms, safety training, mat services. Oh, and restroom supplies.
So uncomplicated. Call Cintas. They'll handle all of it.
Wow, one company can handle all that? That's not very complicated.
So, you'll be ready?
Oh, we'll be ready.
Learn how Cintas can help you get ready for the workday. Visit Cintas.com.
I was diagnosed with diabetic.
High blood pressure.
High cholesterol.
Terrible acid reflux.
Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? Wouldn't you rather be healthy, energetic, and fit? I'm Dennis Black. 10 years ago here in Dallas, I developed a Texas-sized solution to America's health crisis.
TexasSuperfood.com.
I make my Texas Superfood from 55 raw, vine-ripened fruits and vegetables.
Alfalfa leaf, aloe vera, apples, asparagus, raspberry, spinach, all of the nutrients.
You know, it's been barely a week, and already my skin is better.
I lost 60 pounds. I mean, that's huge.
Since I've been on superfood, I haven't been sick.
It's borderline shocking how much energy I have.
Thousands of people take my Texas Superfood every day. Join us on TexasSuperfood.com.
TexasSuperfood.com.
Or call 877-55-TEXAS. That's 877-55-TEXAS. 877-55-TEXAS. Or
TexasSuperfood.com.
The March of Dimes and HCA Healthcare are committed to the best possible start for every baby. I'm Amy Kasseri, Vice President of HCA Women and Children's Services, where we have the honor of delivering over 200,000 babies a year. We partner with the March of Dimes on research and fundraising to help build a brighter future for babies everywhere. So march with us on one of the many HCA teams assembled nationwide. Learn more at marchforbabies.org/HCA.
Why do we call it small business? Why not agile business, nimble business, dance circles around the big bulky behemoths business? Ooma Office, the small business phone solution, has a virtual receptionist to direct calls to the right extension and a mobile app to help you answer while away from the office. About all that's small really is the price, starting at only $19.95 a month. Visit Ooma.com, that's OOMA, or call 866-649-9377 to find out more. Ooma, the phone your small business deserves.
Welcome back. Salt Lake City Talk with Ted, number 47, Harriet Hageman, a civil rights lawyer. Harriet, you with us?
I sure am.
Excellent. I've got new music here for the radio. It's throwing me off. I like the old music. We are discussing your work in Cheyenne, collaborated out of a law firm in Washington, D.C. Why don't you just tell us again a background of that law firm, the New Civil Liberties Alliance?
It was created around 2 years ago by Professor Philip Hamburger from Columbia University, and we are dedicated to focusing on civil liberties in relation to the expansion of the administrative state. So we try to address everything from freedom of speech to freedom of religion. Due process issues are very important. And one of the things that we have spent an incredible amount of time on relates to some decisions that have come out of the United States Supreme Court. We refer to them as the Chevron decision or the Brand X decision or the Auer deference. And what these cases have to do with is it's where the Supreme Court said that courts are required to defer to agency expertise. And we see that as an enormous constitutional problem, as any time you walk into these courts, such as me suing USDA, the thumb is on the scale on the side of USDA. And I've tried enough cases against federal agencies that it's not fair. It's wrong. It's contrary, again, to our constitutional foundation.
Yeah, and so then you'll have the constitutionalists saying, well, there's a problem with the establishment of the agency to begin with, and then that judicial standard of deference, right? Unless it's arbitrary or capricious, then they'll defer to that agency ruling.
Deference, we refer to it as divestment. We refer to it that what Congress has done by empowering these agencies to do what they're doing is it has divested itself of its authority. because Congress is who is supposed to be making laws. And they were very successful.
And then where's the political
accountability?
accountability?
There isn't any.
And then we
the problem.
argue it in just these broad black and white strokes that, if he cuts funding, or if he deregulates, he's not an environmentalist, when I don't think that that's necessarily true.
We talk in sound bites. We don't talk in substance. And our political leaders have led us down that path because they oftentimes don't talk in substance. They talk in sound bites. And it's very, very, very easy to excoriate the EPA over a decision that it has made rather than actually looking at the Clean Water Act and saying, what do we need to do to make this clearer so that people, individuals, property owners, business owners, states and federal agencies understand where federal jurisdiction is, where state jurisdiction is, where local jurisdiction is. How do we define that? These things are fixable. I've worked with these statutes long enough, such as the Clean Water Act, that there are things that could be fixed that could make that so that it's not only effective, but it's implementable at the local level.
Can you give us a little example from your experience?
Sure. The Clean Water Act has an exemption that is not supposed to apply to irrigation. It specifically states that for Section 404 permitting. So it specifically states that irrigation, construction and maintenance, and normal farming and silvicultural tree growing operations are exempt from having to get 404 permits. Yet what the EPA has done over the last 10 years especially, not so much under this administration, but the previous one was terrible. What the EPA has done is they've gone directly after irrigation. So I represented a farmer in Wyoming who moved an irrigation ditch on his property. And the next thing you know, you've got the EPA pounding down his door saying that he violated Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. He wasn't required to get a 404 permit to move an irrigation district or an irrigation ditch by definition. But the EPA interpreted
and that permit
with
would
their
be what?
regulations.
Would it be subject that to inspection during that process?
What they said is he had to get a 404 permit. What it is it's just basically taxation. It's a mechanism by which they get people to cough up lots and lots of money to be able to get 404 permits or any other kind of permit when they're not needed. This is where things have really run aground with these agencies, is they use permitting and fees as a way of self-funding. And this is an example of that. If you have to get a 404 permit, I believe that the average cost for a 404 permit is over $700,000 in 2 years to get a 404 permit. This guy moved an irrigation ditch, affected 2.1 acres on his property. EPA sued him for violating the Clean Water Act, and at one point he was facing penalties of $65 million.
Was there any environmental damage from what he did?
No. In fact, he did such a beautiful job on the project that when we went to trial, the federal government, the Department of Justice, and the EPA attorneys filed a motion with the judge that I was not allowed to tell the jury of all of the environmental benefits of my client's project. He decreased sedimentation into the Bighorn River. He created beautiful habitat for wildlife in the area. It was an absolutely beautiful project, and the judge never allowed me to show the jury a photograph of the project that my client was sued over, because I was not allowed to show the jury the environmental benefits of the project.
What kind of crazy world do we live in?
That's because what they were trying to do is it was a test case. The EPA was clearly trying to use this as a test case to expand its jurisdiction. But what do I mean when Congress could fix that? That is a case that never should have happened. Congress ought to go in and change the Clean Water Act to say, and you can't sue irrigators for moving an irrigation ditch. But they don't fix it. Instead, they complain about the EPA. And I come back to the EPA quite a bit because I've tried.
Is that right? And you could probably cite example after example of that phenomenon.
Absolutely. They went after one of my irrigation districts. Same thing.
And isn't that really what Philip Hamburger is pressing, that the resolution here is that final accountability by the legislature to make binding law on these things and to be accountable for it.
But they don't. And right now we have, on average, Congress is passing maybe 60, 70 laws in a year, and the regulatory agencies are passing or adopting over 3,500 regulations a year. President Obama, as you can probably imagine, in 2016, it was the highest number of regulations and the highest number of pages in the Federal Register of any president in history. And in 2016, they published over 95,000 pages of regulations and related agency action in the Federal Register, and they adopted, I believe it was 3,800 regulations, many of which have an economic impact of over $100 million, considered major federal regulations. That's how they define it, is $100 million. And the billions and billions and billions of money, amount of money that relate to the agency rulemaking under the last administration is astronomical. But keep in mind, that's what President Trump, in part, is trying to get to with this reform on guidance. Because he's trying to say, if you're going to go out there and have an economic impact on these people, you need to be upfront about what you're doing. This stuff all needs to be published, and everybody needs to know about it. This is one of the most important or significant efforts at regulatory reform in my last 20 years of practice. I've been practicing for 30 years, but very heavily in this area for 20 years. This is an astoundingly important effort at regulatory reform because, again, just like what USDA has done in this RFID thing, this isn't even published as a cost, yet USDA has acknowledged that it could cost as much as $1.9 billion to implement an RFID program, and that isn't even disclosed as part of this process of attempting to impose it against my clients and all other livestock.
And where do you stop? Where does you draw the line? At what point is that government authority challengeable? Because again, I'm kind of marvel at this case that you have with the cattle, in that those issues were examined at length during the 2013 rulemaking process. And then just simply disregarded it. And then this idea of the timing of an investigation to trace animals in the event of some outbreak, a little bit of a vague, quicker time to investigate that, it just has me suspect. I'll put it to you that way.
Well, it is why NCLA was created, because that's what we're trying to stop. My firm is focused specifically on the question that you just asked, which is, how do we stop this? What is the threshold by which they can or cannot get away with this? And as I said, this is one of the most egregious examples I've ever seen, where you have a rulemaking, and 6 years later, the agency came in and said, yeah, we're going to use this 2-page fact sheet, and we're going to completely undo that rulemaking, and we're going to cost you as much as $2 billion in the process. But it's cool, because at some point we're going to tell you what we're going to do. And that is an abuse of power that is just absolutely
Yeah, who's watching them if
mind-boggling.
they think they can get away with that? It really feels like the regulators are unregulated.
They are, because Congress doesn't provide oversight.
Do you know what's interesting, Harriet, too, is that, I've spoken a bit about racial relations, and we see the difficulties with police and the use of excessive force and racial relations, and those kind of stories get a lot of press, being, the civil rights stories. But the fights that you're fighting, I think, are equally important, but because they don't involve those sensationalized issues like race relations, always does, that it just doesn't get a lot of attention.
I think that's true. I also think it's more complicated. We've spent an hour and a half or a little over an hour having this discussion now, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners about this, because I went to work for the NCLA in May of this year. I've had a highly successful practice for 30 years, but in the last 20 years I've had my own law firm. And I've loved doing that. I've loved being self-employed. I have a wonderful life in Wyoming. But I made the decision about a year ago that I needed to find some way to focus specifically on trying to right this wrong. Because it not only has affected us in the past, it's continuing to affect us now, and it's getting worse every single day. Not because this administration is not trying to fix it. The fact is that with these 2 executive orders, this president is trying to expose something and fix something that none of his predecessors have attempted to fix in the same way. And I'm incredibly proud of him. I'm proud of this administration for recognizing it. But we have a lot of work to do because we've got to get back to that constitutional foundation. Part of what I see in terms of the dissension and the anger and the frustration and the screaming and yelling that we're seeing out there among our fellow citizens is I think people feel like their lives are not in their own control anymore because they have such a heavy hand of government overlaying everything. And the more that you federalize, the more things get federalized. And things that used to be, decisions that used to be made on a local level or even within your own family have now got this federal overlay, this pressure coming out of Washington, D.C., that I think is driving people a little bit batty. I grew up in Wyoming. I grew up out on a ranch, and when I was growing up, we didn't have TV and we didn't have a telephone for much of my formative years, especially. I really didn't pay any attention to government. Government had very little impact on my life.
Yeah, and politics was a private matter.
It really was, and now it has invaded and it pervades so much of our existence. And it is both at the state level as well as the federal level. And we need to get back to some of our foundational understanding. But something else we need to do, we need to get back to trusting each other. And as long as we have a government between us and trying to dictate our relationship with our fellow citizens, I think that it's creating a tension that is not going to be fixed. We need to be taking responsibility for our fellow man. It's not for government. I just read a horrible article about one of the presidential contenders who actually stood up on a stage not long ago and said he does not believe in charity. He does not believe in charity. He believes that government is responsible for all things that charities now do. And I was sick to my stomach because I think that's exactly the wrong view. You can't fix things. Government doesn't fix things. People fix things.
Right. You've got religious organizations getting together to help people at the border for the immigration crisis, doing a better job than the government's doing, taking care of people's needs.
Just helping our own fellow man. I grew up in a family that took in over 40 foster children growing up.
40.
It's part of our responsibility. That's what you do in a community. That's what you do. You don't expect government is going to be able to solve all those things. It's the individual that solves things.
Yeah, and we've empowered the government so much over the years with that authority and then that corresponding hope that it would be able to solve problems. And I just think we're at a crisis, technological, with the environment. And I don't know what amount of government regulation is really, I don't know if that's really the ultimate answer. I think we need innovation to help solve the problems that humanity has collectively caused.
Well, I do too. And I think that we do know the answer as to whether government is the solution, because for the last 40 years and 50 years, and especially with things such as the war on poverty and all of those things, we know that a lot of that has failed. We know that a lot of it has failed.
And the EPA gets blamed there too for failing to kind of account for economic justice in the administering of its environmental policies.
That's why it comes back for me to local. It comes back to local control. It comes back to people being involved with their own government. I do trust my fellow man, Republican, Democrat, whatever it may be. I trust them to make the right decisions as long as government hasn't been in there to muck it up.
Do you trust me enough to hang on for one final segment?
You bet.
We're going to get back to your case, and you're going to tell us why it's a winner. Talk with Ted. We'll be right back.
You're listening to KTalk Radio, KBJA 1640 AM, Sandy, Salt Lake City, and all across the Wasatch Front. Bringing you live, local two-way talk.
Life's never perfect, but as realtors, we know living it in the perfect place can make a big difference. Imagine hiding from your screeching children in that spacious walk-in closet, watching the neighbor's dog poop on the freshly sodded grass you negotiated during closing, dropping your cell phone in the toilet of the spa-like 5-piece bathroom again. So get the perfect place to house all of life's imperfections. Get Realtor. Realtors are members of the National Association of Realtors.
Message and data rates may apply.
If you're considering going back to school, ask yourself the following questions. Do you need the flexibility to take classes on your schedule? Do you have college credits you need transferred? Do you want to earn a quality degree from a world-renowned university? If you answered yes to any of these questions, Arizona State University is the perfect school for you. Arizona State University offers over 150 highly ranked degree programs 100% online. You'll learn the same degree as you would on campus from wherever you are on your schedule. Plus, ASU Online accepts most transfer credits. For information, text GET to 35517. Learn for yourself why the Wall Street Journal ranks ASU 5th in the nation for producing the best qualified graduates and why 87% of ASU grads are recruited within 90 days of graduation. Learn to grow, learn to succeed, and learn to thrive at Arizona State University. To learn more about ASU Online degrees, text GET to 35517. That's GET to 35517.
Results may vary, not a solicitation for legal services. If you owe the IRS back taxes, payroll taxes, or have not filed your returns, the IRS will get you. They can take your property, take you to court, even put you in jail. With one call to Wall, you'll never need to talk to the IRS again. Our average client settles for about 10% of what is owed. We offer free face-to-face consultations in your local area. Call 800-727-0433. That's 800-727-0433.
When you're dealing with life's ups and downs, it helps to know the ins and outs of insurance. Let Farmers share with you practical knowledge gained from more than 90 years of experience. We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. Find an agent at farmers.com.
We are farmers. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum.
The national debt is now over $20 trillion. What happens next? Rising inflation drops in the dollar's value. Some experts say another crash is coming. You can fight this, not with stocks or bonds, but with gold and silver coins in an IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. Call 855-858-5807 and learn how an IRA backed by physical gold and silver can hedge against inflation. Call Augusta Precious Metals right now at 855-858-5807 and get a free gold IRA guide. Call 855-858-5807.
With McDonald's $1-2-$3 menu, you can choose among favorites like a delicious McChicken for only $1. Just $1 for golden crispy chicken, mayo, and shredded lettuce all nestled between a perfectly toasted bun. So next time you find a crumpled up bill in the pocket of an old jacket, or notice the collection of loose change just chilling in your cup holder, give that change a new lease on life by turning it into a delicious McChicken. Build your meal with favorites like a $1 McChicken on McDonald's $1-2-3 menu. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal.
Welcome back, Salt Lake City. Talk with Ted. My name's Ted McBride. We are in the last segment of episode 47 with Harriet Hageman on. Harriet, are you still with us?
I am.
Did I pronounce that correctly? I hope I did.
You're doing a beautiful job.
I'm terrible. Harriet has been a trial attorney for almost 30 years. She began her focus on water and natural resource issues in 1997 when the state of Wyoming hired her to handle Nebraska versus Wyoming, a dispute over the waters and management of the North Platte River. So you've been involved in these environmental and regulatory issues your whole career.
For a long, long time.
And then you made a run for governor of Wyoming last year.
I did. It was a wonderful experience.
And there are some newspaper articles that say that you're an anti-environmentalist running for governor of Wyoming. Is that what happens when you challenge the authority of the EPA? You get tagged as an anti-environmentalist?
I guess so. Just one of those circumstances where names seem to be the fallback rather than having a legitimate discussion about what the issues are.
Yeah. How was your effort at running for governor? Is that where you were hoping to get involved and make some change?
Well, absolutely. I, again, believe that the states are going to be the saviors, if you will, of our republic. It's the states that need to take their power back. They need to be pushing back against the federal overreach and the federalization of so much of what is happening in this country. The states are the ones that have really abdicated their responsibilities as well. So I'm not just going to pick on Congress. I'm going to pick on states who allowed the federal government to say, we'll give you $50 million, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. The states needed to say, actually, that's our money, because those citizens that live in our state are the ones that sent those taxes to you in the first place.
But what about like a state like California, if they want to impose, more stringent standards on automobiles or driving, can they do that?
You start getting involved with interstate commerce issues, and there are definitely limitations. And that is the one point where you have to look at what is the interstate commerce issue. And so I can't speak to that just in the abstract. It's not an issue that I have dealt with in a great amount of detail.
Yeah,
there's no question that there are federal issues, and there's no question that there are interstate commerce issues. At the same time, there are interstate issues that states need to be more protective of, and I don't think that they were. So that's why I ran. It was one of the issues that I ran on. I ran on federal regulatory reform and really rallying the states to again take back their power and to administer the laws, carry out the laws in a manner that protects their citizens, to focus on their citizens. And that's what I think we need to do.
Yeah. Because, you can have that abuse of government power in every area of government.
Yes.
And it's important for fighters like you to fight back. You know what I find interesting about the case that you have in Wyoming? Your clients' names escape me now.
I have RCAF, and I have Tracy and Donna Hunt.
Tracy
and Kenny and Roxy Fox.
And they are old school cattle folk. I saw one of them had been in the family for 3 generations.
Both families have had these ranches for going on 100 years.
And interestingly, with this electronic tagging, there's an exemption. It's not required if you have...
You're listening to KTalk Radio.
Oh, another error. Not required if you're not moving the cattle out of state. Is that correct?
That's right. It's only for interstate movement of cattle, whether it's moving them to put them in a feedlot or a movement to a packing plant.
And I wonder what the rationale is for that. If the purpose of the law is to, facilitate the timing of that investigation, I just wonder why there's then the exemption if the cattle are not crossing state lines. Don't they need to be identified as quickly as the others?
I don't know who all was involved in drafting the rules, so I can't answer what the interest was there. I think you've picked up on a very important point, but I think that something that's even worse is that interstate cattle that are moved here from other countries are not subject to RFID, and let me explain the significance of that. The United States has the safest meat supply of any country in the world. And our cattle producers have done a phenomenal job of managing their herds in a very healthy way. We do have problems with livestock that come in from Canada and Mexico, however. And the interesting thing is the RFID requirement does not apply to imported cattle.
Really?
Yes.
That's shocking. So the cows that aren't leaving the state doesn't apply to them,
right.
And it doesn't apply to the ones that are crossing the border.
That's exactly right. So
Is that true even if they jump the fence?
Well, and I recently read one of the documents issued by USDA.
That was a bad joke, Harriet. That was my bad border joke.
Jump the fence to get the border.
It was issued by USDA, and they said that they needed to have RFID in Texas because they've got a problem with cattle coming in from Mexico that have the Mexican tick. But those cattle are not subject to RFID.
But the other ones
Number one. And number two, Texas has packing plants. So again,
so they wouldn't have to have it anyway.
What is the problem they're trying to fix, and does this do it? And I will go back and I will defend what they did in 2013, because they at least did that through a proper rulemaking procedure.
Yeah.
What I cannot defend is what they're doing in 2019 by issuing a fact sheet and forcing RFID on all livestock producers that move their cattle interstate.
Yeah, and I got to believe that even the information relied upon in the 2013 workup, even that would need to be updated. I mean, if there's going to be a change, the whole thing needs to be reconsidered.
That's why you go through a rulemaking. And once you adopt a rule, once an agency adopts a regulation through a notice and comment APA rulemaking, if and when they want to change it, they have to go back through the same process. And one of the things that they have to address is what has changed.
So how was this brought to your attention? Because I got to tell you, when this fact sheet came out in April 2019 by the USDA, Advancing Animal Disease Traceability, a plan to achieve electronic identification in cattle and bison, that got by me. I didn't see that was released back in April. How did that get to your attention?
The livestock producers brought it to my attention.
I mean, they just come running in and say, look what they're doing now.
And that's, again, what NCLA is designed to do. People get a hold of us, or we find people, and they say, I was constructing a pond, and the next thing I know, I've got the EPA coming after me, and they're trying to say that I violated Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and I don't see how I possibly could have because it's exempt. Those are the kinds of things NCLA does. So when I was contacted in July by one of the livestock producers, he said, we received this fact sheet because he pays a lot of attention. Tracy Hunt pays a lot of attention, as does Kenny Fox. They pay a lot of attention to what's going on with USDA and their industry, as most livestock producers
and is it just published on the USDA website?
It was. I tried to find it today, and I can't find it. The link says that it gets you that 404 notice that the document no longer exists, and I could not find the document on the USDA website today.
Now, you just filed this lawsuit a couple of weeks ago.
I believe we mailed it out on the 4th of October, and it would have been filed early the next week in Wyoming. So, yes, maybe the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th of October is when it was filed. Brand new. The president made his announcement, I believe it was the 9th or so of the 8th or 9th of October of the executive order. So everything is kind of overlapped with each other. But I was just contacted by the producers, did the investigation and research, found that what they did was wrong, and drafted the complaint and got it filed.
Yeah, I see the complaint was filed October 4th, and so it was just 5 days later that you had the President of the United States seemingly endorsing your position, is what it looks like to me.
I know, isn't that wonderful?
That is. And you have, this is a petition, a declaratory judgment action, where you're actually asking the federal court to declare this rule or memo unconstitutional and of no legal effect, right?
Unlawful, absolutely, violating the APA, the 2013 regulation, the RFA Regulatory Flexibility Act, the CRA, Congressional Review Act. It was never submitted to Congress, and certain regulations have to be submitted to Congress or they cannot go into effect. And this one clearly has serious economic impacts associated with it. They never submitted it to Congress for review, so they violated the Congressional Review Act. And then they also violated the Federal Advisory Committee Act. As I indicated, they just kept kind of reducing that advisory committee until it was only left with the people who supported RFID.
It looks like a really strong claim, I got to tell you.
I hope so.
It's a really well-written complaint. It's a long one. It's 46, 48 pages. Now, since this was just filed, you're probably in the process of serving it, and then do you anticipate some sort of hearing on an injunction? Because this law doesn't go into effect for 4 years. I think it's January 1st, 2023, but I would imagine that there's some urgency in getting this legal issue resolved.
There is, because of certainty and stability. Our industry folks need to know what they're required to do. And it's actually phased in over a 3-year period. It would be essentially December 31st, 2022. So it's a 3-year window. But that's part of the expense associated with it, is to be able to retrofit your operations in order to run a full RFID program. Our producers need to know if that's what they have to do. The next
and especially when they're running those horseback operations, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're going to have to retrofit corrals. They're going to have to retrofit chutes. They're going to have to retrofit our sale barns, there's a variety of things that would have to be done, and it's not going to be done instantaneously. So that's why they are doing a phase-in period of time. But the next step is that I anticipate the USDA is going to do some kind of a response. And one response would be to file an answer denying our claims. Another response could be that they withdraw that 2-page fact sheet. And if they withdraw that 2-page fact sheet and say they're not going to enforce it, then we win. Another option is...
I have a feeling that's where this is going.
I just don't know. I think that what happened...
I take your word, with the experience that you have over the years in dealing with these things, that this is just really egregious, and it looks that way to me. It looks just stunning, just flies in the face of the whole process in 2013.
Mm-hmm. You hit it right on the head.
Maybe they didn't know you had President Trump looming over your shoulder there.
That was a bonus.
And I don't think he gets enough credit. It's easy to vilify him. It's easy to want to separate yourself from him personally. He can be crass and not very articulate. But I don't think that the mainstream media wants to properly credit him. And in this instance, I think he deserves it.
I agree with you, and here's what I'm going to say. Personalities aside, I'm interested in results. We all have our own idiosyncrasies, and I'm interested in results. And the results here are to push back and force an agency to withdraw something that it was illegal when they issued it. And however we get there, we get there. And if that is that they may file a motion to dismiss, and we'll brief it. If they file a motion to dismiss, I anticipate that they will be arguing that it is not final agency action, that it is guidance, that it's not a final rule, and therefore is not subject to a legal challenge. But if it is not a final rule, and if it is only guidance, it cannot be legally enforced by definition. So the USDA is must be in quite a quandary right now, because if they argue that this wasn't final agency action and not a final rule, they cannot force the livestock producers to implement it. So that's one of the reasons why you don't do what they did. You don't do the shortcuts, because ultimately it's going to come back and bite you. In this circumstance, it's going to come back and bite USDA, but I'm okay with that.
I say, do the shortcut if you want to do it again, right?
Pardon me?
I said you can take the shortcut if you're just ready to do it again.
Right,
because you're going to have to do it
again. And in this
again.
circumstance, we've got the 2013 regulation. That's what applies. And what they're trying to do with the fact sheet is illegal and shouldn't be allowed to stand.
Well, I hope that you get it brushed aside quickly. I can hear the music at the top of the hour. We're out of time. The time always goes fast, but I really cherish the opportunity to spend this much time discussing these issues with you, because they're subtle and nuanced, and I don't think that the public really takes the time to understand them. And so thank you for the great work you do fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Ted. This was lovely.
We will follow up on the outside, and I think you're going to win this lawsuit in Wyoming faster than you think.
Thank you.
I will be back next week. I don't know with whom. It'll be October 29th, but right now, October 22nd, end of another great show. Thank you, Harriet. New Civil Liberties Alliance. Interesting stuff. You can learn more about it online. Until next week, I'll be back. Thanks for listening, folks.